The HOA was supposed to be a safeguard, a community organization designed to uphold property values, maintain common areas, and handle neighborhood disputes with fairness. At least, that's what they promised in their glossy brochures and neighborly meetings. What they actually became was something far more sinister, a petty, power-hungry entity that saw my deployment not as a sacrifice for my country, but as an opportunity to pad their coffers. It started innocently enough, or so I thought. Before my deployment, I notified the HOA of my extended absence, provided them with my emergency contact information, and made sure all dues were paid ahead for the year. I even arranged for a friend to occasionally check on the house. I believed I had covered every base. I trusted that my home, the product of years of hard work, countless hours of overtime, and dreams of a peaceful return, would be exactly as I left it. What I didn't know was that the HOA had been eyeing my property for some time. They liked the corner lot, the extra parking, the big yard. It was prime real estate for short-term rental income, something they had quietly been experimenting with through a so-called community enhancement initiative. This policy was never formally approved by a vote of the homeowners. Mind you, it was concocted by a few board members who saw dollar signs whenever they looked at vacant properties. Mine, apparently, was too tempting to resist. While I was halfway around the world, sleeping in a dusty cot under the weight of combat gear, running missions through streets I barely understood the names of, the HOA was back home hosting cozy meetings in climate control clubhouses. They voted, without my knowledge, without even attempting to reach me through my emergency contact, to seize temporary control of my property under some warped clause they claimed allowed them to manage absentee properties for the benefit of the community. They drafted up a lease, found tenants looking for a cheap rental in a nice neighborhood, and began collecting rent. They even arranged for cleaning crews to stage my house, moving my personal belongings into the garage and locking it. Family photos, service medals, private letters, boxed up like rummage sale leftovers. They placed fresh welcome mats at the door, advertised it on rental sites, and watched the money roll in. Meanwhile, I was patrolling hostile territory, dodging IEDs, thinking that the worst thing waiting for me back home might be a few stray weeds in the front yard. I found out by sheer accident. A buddy from my platoon who happened to rotate back stateside earlier drove by my house to snap a photo for me, thinking it might lift my spirits. Instead, he sent me a picture that nearly made my heart stop. Strangers' cars in the driveway, kids' bikes on the lawn, a barbecue grill I didn't own smoking away on my back patio. Confused and panicked, I called my emergency contact. He went by the house, knocked on the door, and was greeted by a completely bewildered family who claimed they were renting it legally through the HOA. You can imagine my fury. I was halfway across the globe, unable to do a damn thing to stop these people from living in my home. The HOA, when finally reached by email weeks later, brushed me off with hollow bureaucratic language. They claimed they had exercised their right under the community maintenance provisions, and that they were ensuring the property did not become an eyesore or target for crime in the owner's absence. They conveniently left out the part about collecting thousands in rent. The betrayal cut deep. I'd signed up to defend my country, believing in the rule of law, property rights, and basic decency. Meanwhile, a group of suburban power brokers back home had decided my service was an inconvenience, that my absence made me vulnerable, and that vulnerability was a chance for them to profit. They were so sure of themselves, so confident in the small print of their governing documents, and the complacency of homeowners who never attended meetings. All the while, they sent me automated emails about landscaping updates and holiday light contests, as if nothing were amiss. Each cheerful note was another twist of the knife. They had crossed a line not just of legality, but of human decency exploiting a deployed service member's sacrifice for their own gain. They saw a soldier's empty house and thought, easy money. When I first discovered what the HOA had done, I felt a kind of helplessness I'd never experienced before. It was unlike anything the battlefield could throw at me. Out there, I knew my enemy, knew the terrain, carried the tools of war on my back, and had a tight-knit team I trusted with my life. But this was betrayal by the very people who were supposed to be looking out for my interests while I was away. And I was thousands of miles from home, with no immediate way to fight back. The sense of powerlessness clawed at me day and night. I'd lie awake on my cot long after the lights were out, staring at the cracked ceiling of some makeshift barracks, replaying the same nightmare over and over. I pictured strangers sleeping in my bed, cooking in my kitchen, laughing on my porch. They were living in the one place that was supposed to be my refuge, the home I planned to return to after the chaos of deployment. The place where I had once imagined planting a garden, hosting family barbecues, maybe even starting a family of my own someday. Meanwhile, my reality was dust, sweat, and the constant edge of danger. One part of me was hyper-focused on my mission, scanning rooftops and alleys for threats, keeping my brothers alive. The other part of me was trapped back home, wandering the halls of my house in my imagination, seeing ghostly images of strangers rifling through my drawers, of my personal things shoved into boxes. Whenever the platoon had downtime, I'd sit with my phone, using our limited internet to send frantic emails back and forth. I contacted the HOA again and again, trying to make them see reason or at least acknowledge that what they did was wrong. Their responses were maddeningly dismissive, full of citations to obscure bylaws and smug assurances that they were acting within their chartered responsibilities. It was like arguing with a brick wall that wore a cheap suit and carried a gavel. I tried calling, too, but the time zone difference and spotty service made real conversations nearly impossible. Why did it get through? It was to some office administrator who treated my situation like just another file on her cluttered desk. She told me, with mechanical politeness, that the board had followed proper procedures and that any disputes could be formally addressed upon your return. As if I was complaining about a missed trash pickup instead of having my home stolen out from under me. I also reached out to a lawyer back in the States, scraping together money for my deployment pay to put him on retainer. He reviewed the HOA's covenants and confirmed my worst fear. They had twisted certain clauses just enough to make a legal fight difficult and drawn out. Sure, it was unethical, probably even illegal under protections for active duty service members, but the HOA had resources and knew how to delay, obfuscate, and drown people in paperwork until they gave up or went broke. All of this took a heavy toll on me mentally. My platoon started to notice. I wasn't sleeping well. I was snappier on patrols, less patient during planning sessions. It's hard to keep your head on a swivel when half your mind is thousands of miles away, consumed by visions of your life being picked apart by strangers and opportunistic HOA busybodies. More than once, my buddies pulled me aside and tried to get me to open up. At first, I didn't want to burden them. We all carried our own private weights. Families struggling back home, relationships falling apart, children growing up without fathers. But eventually, it all came pouring out one night over MREs and stale coffee. I told them how the HOA had leased out my home behind my back, how I couldn't even reach the people living there, how I felt like I'd lost everything I was fighting for. They didn't mock me or brush it off. Instead, I saw something spark in their eyes, that same protective loyalty that kept us watching each other's backs in the worst situations. They told me I wasn't crazy for being angry, that what happened to me was a disgrace. In a strange way, sharing it gave me a little of my strength back. It reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone, even if I was powerless to act for now. Still, the days dragged on painfully slow. Every time I geared up for a mission, there was a small, sick part of me that wondered if I'd even have a home to return to by the time my deployment ended. Whether they'd decide to extend the lease, or worse, claim my property outright for unpaid fees or some bogus fine they drummed up. It gnawed at me, twisted me up inside, left me feeling like a stranger in my own life. Once the initial shock and helpless rage began to settle, I knew I couldn't afford to just sit on my hands and hope this problem would go away. If there's one thing military life teaches you, it's that you have to work with the tools you've got, even if they're limited, and you have to prepare for every possibility. I might have been stuck overseas, but that didn't mean I was going to let the HOA trample my rights without putting up a fight. I decided the best weapon I could wield right then was evidence, clear, undeniable documentation of everything the HOA was doing. If I couldn't physically be there to defend my property, I could at least build a case strong enough to hold them accountable when the time came. I started by asking my friend, the same one who'd driven by and discovered strangers living in my house, to start taking detailed photos and videos. Not just of the people's cars in my driveway, but of the renters coming and going, the new furniture they'd moved in, even the packages being delivered in someone else's name. He captured video of kids playing on my lawn, renters hosting gatherings on my back patio, all while my own belongings were locked away in the garage. It was surreal seeing those images from half a world away, like watching a movie of someone else's life playing out inside my home. But it was also necessary. The more visual evidence I had, the harder it would be for the HOA to spin some story about how they were merely maintaining the property. At the same time, I combed through every document I had ever received from the HOA. Deployment leaves you with long hours to kill between missions, and I spent many of those late nights hunched over my tablet, reading the fine print of the community bylaws and CC and RS. I highlighted sections that explicitly restricted the HOA's power, clauses that guaranteed property rights to homeowners, and anything that could contradict their absurd claim of authority to lease out my house. I found several references to protections for absentee owners and provisions that only allowed the HOA to step in for emergency maintenance. Things like roof leaks or structural hazards, not property management for rental income. With every discovery, I forwarded the information to my lawyer. He began drafting letters to the HOA, carefully citing the relevant laws and hinting at violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. That federal protection exists precisely because too many service members have faced shady actions back home while they were away serving. It was infuriating to realize that even with such laws in place, HOAs could still dance around them with enough technical jargon and arrogance, counting on most people not to fight back. We also started collecting copies of the HOA's communications. Every dismissive email, every contradictory explanation, every vague assurance that the board was acting in the community's best interest went into a growing file. I instructed my emergency contact to save every piece of mail that arrived at the house, especially anything with HOA letterhead. He scanned and sent me invoices, notices, meeting minutes, all of which painted a picture of an organization that was making up policy as they went along. What struck me most was how casual they were in writing. They referred to renting out homes in our development as part of a pilot program, proudly discussing the revenue it brought in to cover community landscaping and clubhouse upgrades. They spoke about my house almost like it was an investment property the association jointly owned, not the private residence of a deployed soldier who had trusted them to simply keep the neighborhood tidy. That arrogance showed through in nearly every memo, and while it disgusted me, it also gave me more ammunition. Even my platoon pitched in. On quiet nights, a couple of my buddies who were more tech-savvy helped me organize files into shared drives, label each piece of evidence, and build a chronological timeline of what had happened. They joked that it was like preparing an intel briefing, only instead of insurgent movements, we were tracking the slimy decisions of a suburban HOA board. The humor helped cut through the bitterness, but under it all was a shared sense of outrage. They understood what it meant to pour everything into a home, to have it symbolize safety and the future, only to watch it be hijacked by people who cared more about extra income than about right or wrong. Piece by piece, I was constructing a case, even if it felt painstakingly slow. Every document, every photo, every recorded voicemail became a small act of resistance, a promise to myself that I wouldn't let these people get away with what they'd done. I knew there was still a long road ahead, but at least now I had something solid to fight with, something that proved this wasn't just a soldier's paranoid fantasy cooked up from too many sleepless nights on deployment. It was real, it was wrong, and I was preparing to hold them accountable. When my deployment finally ended and I stepped off that plane on a home soil, I felt a rush of emotions that was hard to untangle. Relief, fatigue, cautious joy at seeing familiar sights again. But beneath it all burned a cold, relentless anger that had been simmering for months. I wasn't just coming home to reunite with family or start settling back into civilian life. I was coming home to take back what was mine. And I wasn't coming alone. My platoon had been with me through the worst of it. Firefights, ambushes, IED scares that still haunted my dreams. They had listened to me vent night after night about the HOA's betrayal, watched me pore over legal documents and witness statements instead of catching much-needed sleep. So when the time came for me to return, several of them arranged to be on leave at the same time. They didn't do it because they wanted a free trip. They did it because they were brothers. They told me outright they weren't going to let me walk back into this mess by myself. Landing stateside, we piled into a couple of rented trucks and drove straight from the airport to my neighborhood. I remember gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white, adrenaline thundering through my veins, my jaw clenched tight. As we turned onto my street, my heart started pounding even harder. There was my house, my front yard, the porch I'd dreamed of relaxing on after so many dusty nights overseas. But also still there were other people's cars, toys scattered on the grass. A bicycle leaned against my mailbox. Signs of life that didn't belong to me. My platoon dismounted in quiet, practiced fashion, scanning the area almost by instinct. Old habits from deployment die hard. They weren't armed like we would be on a mission, but the weight of our collective presence was enough. We walked up to my front door, and I rang the bell with a finger that was practically vibrating. A man answered, mid-30s, wearing a ball cap and flip-flops, holding a soda can, completely oblivious to the storm standing on his doorstep. He seemed confused at first, trying to process who we were and why half a dozen hard-edge veterans were crowded on his stoop. When I told him calmly that this was my house, that I was the owner and intended to take possession immediately, his face twisted in irritation. He tried to argue, talking about the lease agreement he had signed with the HOA, how he'd paid rent in good faith, how he had every right to be there. My patience was razor thin, but I still kept my voice level as I explained that the lease was invalid, that I had been deployed under federal protection, and that the HOA had overstepped their authority. He didn't back down at first. He threatened to call the police. I encouraged him to do so. In fact, I pulled out my phone and said I'd be happy to call them myself. The look on his face shifted when he realized we weren't going to be intimidated by threats. Behind me, my guys stood silent, arms folded, expressions unreadable. The renter's kids peeked out from the living room window, eyes wide, sensing something was very wrong. Eventually, the renter called the HOA president, putting the call on speaker. That's when the conversation truly soured. The HOA president tried to sound authoritative, telling me I was creating a disturbance, that they had everything documented, and that I needed to vacate the premises until their legal team sorted things out. I cut him off, told him I'd already retained counsel, had a mountain of documented evidence, and that if he wanted to continue this charade, I'd be happy to let the police and the local news sort it out. What ultimately changed the dynamic wasn't just my words, it was the undeniable force of my platoon standing there with me. Their silent support made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. They weren't threatening anyone, they weren't breaking any laws, but their very presence was a statement. I was not alone, and I wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. The HOA president's tone faltered after that, shifting from arrogance to brittle caution. He finally said they'd review the situation and hung up. I gave the renter a reasonable timeline to start packing up, made it clear I understood he'd been misled by the HOA, just like I had been deceived, and that my fight was ultimately not with him. Even so, I also made sure he knew we were staying close by, monitoring everything, and that he would not be continuing to live in my home under false pretenses. Watching him scramble to make phone calls, starting to gather his family's belongings, I felt a grim vindication. Meanwhile, my platoon set about securing the property in simple, subtle ways. They checked doors, made note of any damages, and quietly started moving my boxed-up belongings from the garage back inside. We operated with the same efficient teamwork we'd used overseas. Only now, it was focused on reclaiming a house instead of clearing a building in hostile territory. Each small step felt like I was physically reclaiming a piece of my life that had been stolen. It didn't take long after we made our presence known for the situation to start unraveling for the HOA. Once the renters realized the full weight of what had happened, that the HOA had leased them a home belonging to an active duty service member deployed overseas, under questionable authority and with dubious paperwork, they became more nervous by the hour. Their initial resistance shifted to awkward apologies, and before the weekend was over, they were hauling furniture into rented trucks, kids trailing behind with stuffed animals clutched in their arms. Watching them leave stirred up a mix of feelings in me. I wasn't heartless. I knew they'd been caught in this just like I had. But there was also undeniable satisfaction in finally seeing my home return to me. My platoon stuck around to help with everything. We documented the entire transition. Photos of every room, videos of the condition the house was left in, a thorough walkthrough that cataloged damages and anything that seemed out of place. They treated it almost like prepping an after-action report, careful and methodical, making sure there'd be no question later about what was found or how it was handled. We found scuffs on the walls, stains on the carpet, a cracked window in the guest bedroom, a handful of bills with the renter's names still coming to my address. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to prove that the HOA had never had my best interests in mind when they decided to take control of my property. Within a few days of the renters clearing out, I changed the locks and reset the security system. My emergency contact came by with a truckload of essentials, fresh bedding, groceries, cleaning supplies, and we set about making the place feel like mine again. Even small tasks like scrubbing the countertops or airing out the closets felt like reclaiming stolen territory. My platoon laughed, teased me about how I fussed over the exact placement of my old coffee table, but every joke was layered with relief. We all knew what could have happened if I come home months later, if I hadn't started gathering evidence from overseas, if I hadn't had friends willing to stand beside me. The HOA didn't just fade in the background, though. Their president and a couple of board members came by in person one morning, dressed in business casual clothing that suddenly looked like thin armor. They tried to keep things professional, brandishing clipboards and printed community rules, talking in calm tones about clarifying the misunderstanding. They danced around the fact that they had taken rent money off a lease they never should have signed, and instead focused on how the association had simply acted in the best interest of maintaining property standards. I didn't let them control the narrative. I had copies of their emails, annotated sections of our governing documents, photographs of strangers living in my house, and letters from my attorney citing state statutes and federal laws. Every time they tried to steer the conversation back to vague policy language, I countered with specifics that made them visibly squirm. It wasn't long before their polite, clipped smiles started to crack. What really forced their hand, though, was the looming threat of exposure. Word travels fast in neighborhoods, and my situation was the sort of scandal that residents loved to whisper about. A couple of local veterans groups had already caught wind of it, some because of mutual friends in my platoon, others because my lawyer wisely shared the story with contacts who took these kinds of injustices personally. The HOA board realized this wasn't going to stay a quiet internal matter. They were facing not only possible legal action under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, but also the wrath of a community that suddenly saw them for what they were: opportunists willing to exploit a deployed soldier for the sake of a few extra dollars. I never raised my voice during those meetings. I didn't have to. I simply laid out the facts, let the weight of their own decisions hang in the air, and made it clear that I was prepared to pursue every legal and public avenue available. The HOA's lawyer, who eventually joined these discussions, clearly advised them to back down. It became obvious in the tight way they held their clipboards, the short nods they exchanged. They wanted this problem to disappear before it ended up on local news segments or dragged them into a costly court battle that would tarnish the entire development's reputation. By the time we reached an agreement, the board was practically tripping over itself to appear cooperative. They offered to cover damages to my home, reimburse some of the costs I'd incurred, and promised formal amendments to community policies to ensure no one else ever had their property hijacked like this. My lawyer insisted on everything in writing, with signatures from every board member. Watching them sign those documents felt like securing the final line on a mission report, the point where you could finally say the objective had been achieved. It wasn't about the money or even the repairs. It was about forcing the HOA to acknowledge what they'd done, making sure they couldn't spin it as a simple misunderstanding. The entire ordeal had stripped away their smug certainty. The forced eviction of the renters, the legal threats, the involvement of my brothers in arms, all of it combined to ensure there was no sweeping this under the rug. In the weeks that followed, the dust finally started to settle, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could begin piecing my life back together in the house that was rightfully mine. But even with the locks changed, the HOA cowed, and my furniture restored to its rightful place, something in me felt permanently altered. Coming home should have been a triumph, a long-awaited exhale after surviving months of risk and uncertainty overseas. Instead, it carried this heavy residue, a reminder that sometimes the deepest wounds come not from foreign battlefields but from betrayal close to home. My platoon slowly trickled back to their own families and obligations, leaving me to the quiet of my living room. Their absence was felt in a new kind of silence. No more half-laughed stories of deployment, no more boots scattered by the door, no more inside jokes echoing down my hallway. I appreciated what they'd done for me more than I could ever fully say. They'd been my shield both in combat and back here, facing an enemy that wore collared shirts and carried board minutes instead of rifles. Now that they were gone, I found myself pacing through the house late at night, restless, almost expecting another ambush, though this time it would be by paperwork or hollow apologies rather than gunfire. Even simple things felt layered with strange significance. The first time I sat on my porch again, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the rooftops, it was with this sharp awareness that just months before, strangers had stood there too, laughing and making memories on ground that had cost me so much. When I opened my kitchen cabinets to restock them with groceries, I did it slowly, taking inventory of what had survived and what hadn't, almost like checking gear after a mission. Some of my old mugs were missing, a few plates chipped, small losses on the surface, but they seemed to symbolize the private sanctity that had been carelessly violated. I started attending the HOA's open meetings, not because I trusted them or had any desire to be part of their rituals, but because I refused to ever again let them operate without oversight. I'd sit quietly in the back, taking notes, my very presence a reminder that I wasn't going to disappear or forget. Some of the board members couldn't meet my eyes. Others put on overly bright smiles, the kind that tried to paper over awkward truths. I didn't need to confront them. Just being there, a living, breathing witness to what they try to pull, was enough to shift the balance. Meanwhile, my lawyer finalized agreements that ensured every dollar the HOA had improperly profited off my house was returned, along with documented commitments to revise their internal policies. Watching those funds land in my account didn't exactly feel victorious. It felt transactional, like a financial bandage over something much deeper. No amount of reimbursement could erase the nights I'd spent half a world away, sick with worry, or the creeping dread that my homecoming would be to an empty shell of a life I'd once carefully built. Still, it was accountability, and in that sense, it mattered. I also found myself fielding calls from other homeowners in the community. Some were supportive, quietly horrified by what had happened, wanting to know if they might be next. A few were veterans themselves or had family serving, and their voices took on a tight edge when they thanked me for standing up. Others seemed merely curious, perhaps worried about how this drama might impact their property values. It was a reminder that neighborhoods often run on gossip and thin alliances, and that the person who's your polite wave-over-the-hedge neighbor today could just as easily sit silently tomorrow while your rights are steamrolled. Inside my own walls, I try to find comfort in the normal again. I rehung old photos of my platoon overseas, arranged my modest collection of souvenirs from past deployments, set up my home gym in the garage like I had planned before all this. Some nights I'd turn up the music just to fill the empty spaces, or I'd step outside and breathe in the scent of cut grass, telling myself this was mine, this yard, this roof, these battered walls. But beneath the slow return to routine lived a lesson that would shape how I moved through life from that point on. I no longer took anything about home for granted. The concept of safety had shifted. It was no longer just about deadbolts and neighborhood watch signs. It was about vigilance against even the polite, administrative threats that could pry into your private world and claim it as their own. That was a reality I carried into every interaction with the HOA, every conversation with neighbors, every letter that landed in my mailbox bearing their official letterhead. It also left me more protective than ever of the people around me. Friends who were still active duty or reservists would hear my story and shake their heads, sometimes in anger, sometimes with resignation. I found myself urging them to keep meticulous records, to appoint contacts they trusted absolutely, to question every fee, every policy change, every small encroachment on their rights. What happened to me became a cautionary tale in our circles, a dark sort of folklore about how quickly trust could be shattered by those meant to serve a community's best interest.